All right, so our next timeline on the list is urban life. Now, this is timeline number 11. Timelines that lead to this. Most notably, obviously, we could go all the way back to the agricultural revolution, which leads to the population boom. We also have the big one, though, obviously, is the industrial revolution. Okay, the industrial revolution, and that leads to increased populations within the cities. All right. Now, the big one that we don't usually put for this, but actually has the biggest impact here, is our last timeline. Our last timeline was that class struggle. It was that conservatives versus the liberals, which is the 1800s to 1850. But our key cluster here is the social. There's really only one major key concept, and I do want to note here, guys, what we've done is we have taken this old feudal pyramid and we're done with it. What was the death of this for European history? It's been a key cluster for every timeline. Do you remember what the death is? French Rev. So we don't care about it anymore. It's not a social cluster. It's not a cluster anymore. It's been replaced by social classes. The two social classes that replaced it are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Karl Marx, 1800s, identified that the history of Europe is a history of class study, of class differences. Now, for our timeline itself, let's do 1900, 1800, 1700. To go a little background, we need to look at the economics. Now the economic kind of style that went 1600s into the 1700s, along with exploration, along with absolutism, was the economic style of mercantilism. Right? Mercantilism. Write this real low against the timeline. Okay? Now, after mercantilism, when we got into the 1700s, right, the Enlightenment era, we ended up with Adam Smith and laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is the idea that the government should in fact be hands-off. That's when we still had our social pyramid, and Adam Smith, the liberal, wanted to get away from nobles creating everything. What we're moving to now, and this really should be all the way in the 1800s, but I'm going to write it right here, is a term that I haven't mentioned before. It's called interventionalists. Interventionalists. Okay? Now, this represents the social class struggles that we have. Okay? Coming out of the Enlightenment, our big key cluster, our big thought process, we actually saw today in class, is the idea of going from faith to reason. Well, this new economic style called interventionalist is looking at class society, looking at what we actually look like inside of a country, and they are applying reason. And the big idea of interventionalism is, well, let me ask you this question. How does mercantilism, how does laissez-faire, how does old conservatism, how do they treat the lower classes? Okay? Not good. They don't do a lot for them. What do the lower classes give to society? Really nothing, right? They don't pay taxes. They do maybe have a job, but it's not meaningful labor. They don't apply much. Primarily because they don't earn enough money, so they don't pay taxes, they don't buy a lot of goods and drive the economy. So, the old style, looking at it with emotions and ideology, is let's just ignore those people, right? They give us nothing, let's give them nothing. But interventionalist actually says, hey, if we have a group of poor people that aren't producing anything, better than ignoring them, do you know what we should do? Help them, right? We help them, lift them up to maybe that lower middle class. They have better jobs, and most importantly, they start paying taxes, right? So, it's actually social policies for the less privileged. If we had to synthesize that with something, we would synthesize it with Britain after World War II. Do you remember the title we used for Britain after World War II? You do. We called it a social welfare state. Okay? This is very similar to a social welfare state. So, With that said, we actually look at the industrial route. So up top, if you will, switch colors. Let's do the Industrial Revolution. It's really very late 1700s. Do this all the way up at the top underneath the cluster. And really well into the 1900s. It really goes until what in the 1900s? World War I. Okay? So we have this as the Industrial Revolution. And there's really two sides. It's not, it's not time-wise, it's not one and then the other. They're going on at the same time, but it's really two sides. The first one is as more people moved into the cities, as we got a more urban society, we ran into some issues. A lot of you remember the issues with an overcrowded city? Come on, what are they?
Poor sanitation.
Sanitation. What if you put a lot of poor people in a small area?
It's overcrowded.
Crime, right? Crime, sanitation, stuff like that. How are these cities going to solve that problem? Society is not going to suddenly band together and solve these issues themselves. What really happens is the government's role expands. Okay, the government roles expands because of these urban problems. We still see it today. There's a bigger police force in the city of Cincinnati than there is in Middletown, or than there is out in Anderson or Claremont County, because they have a lot more densely populated people, and therefore they have more issues with crime, and then more issues with sanitation or something like that. So the government expands. What they do, and this is the key concept for it, is how do you fix sewage problems? How do you fix utility problems? How do you fix crime problems? How do you fix some other things? You do it through, they modernize. What do we call our sewage system, our water system, our bridges, our roads, our prisons? Infrastructure. They modernize infrastructure. They modernize infrastructure, okay? And what are the different parts? Number one, to solve crime, they do PP, okay? First P is police. Second P is, if you arrest a lot of people, what do you need? Prisons, right? So police and prisons. The next P is public health. And what do we look at with public health? They build sewers, okay, and water. Also, one big problem was this urban life early on is everybody had to live right downtown, right next to the factories. They couldn't move farther out. Why couldn't they move farther out? They couldn't afford any type of transportation for themselves. So what the government does to solve that is they create public transportation. It might be railroads. We also you remember looking at cable cars, right? So public transportation. And then finally, in public health here, is we completely redesigned the cities. So we'll call it urban redesign. We looked at one city especially that realized it needed to catch up. That was 1851. Paris, France, went to, where did they go in 1851? And realized they were far behind Great Britain. They went to the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. Don't write that down. But they go there, they realize they're screwed. They come back, and you remember, they bulldozed buildings in Paris. So they had long, straight, and wide streets so that they could put in railroads. They could put in railroad stations. They could rebuild a lot of these buildings and industry and transportation so that the city could modernize. It goes from being Middle Ages to now a modern city with room for train stations above all else. Another thing, if you have room down here, is how the government can help people. The best investment, I'm very biased here, the best investment that a government can make for society, the best return on this investment is how? How do you help poor people above all else? Education. Public education. The third P of modernizing infrastructure in urban life. Okay? Do you know who the first proponent of public education in Europe was? It was right here. And it was the most modern, progressive, liberal that we had. It was Napoleon. Okay? Not only create a bank, but he did public education. Why does public education help? First off, I told you, the economy. Because all of you are here in school, when you graduate, you're going to have a better job. You're going to get paid more, you're going to pay better taxes, you're going to help our government, and you're going to help our economy. The other reason, and it goes for what we're looking at politically, in the background of this timeline. Our next timeline is actually titled this. It's the word that defines the second half of European history. Nationalism. Guys, what do you do? What do you do every morning you come to school? Say the pledge, right? You are able to build nationalism. That's an extreme example of some trying to compare to the 1800s, but you can teach the history of your country. You can build a common language, a common social mindset, common economics. That builds your economy as or builds your nationalism as a country. The other side of this, what's the opposite of government-run stuff? It's private. Privatization. Now, the biggest issue for people, again, is the social policies, right? We're going to find a way to help the less privileged. How are the private regions going to help the poor people, which includes poor people, the elderly, like women who have lost their husbands, widows, the Sunday school movement? I think this is pretty big in American history too. And then finally, what's a big problem? The poor, especially the men among the poorer societies, the fathers, alcoholism. So we had, they call it the temperance movement. The temperance movement. They were anti-alcohol. And finally, one last one, a key concept I didn't know where to put, but I think fits in this social or private change, was feminists. Okay. Feminists in the middle 1800s, what do you think of? American history? Seneca Falls, right. Now, feminists before this were trying to get equality in the workplace. And even though they're not there, they have made great strides towards equality in the workplace and industrialization. What's the next target for feminists? We'll call it legal rights. But really, you're right, at the turn of the century, it's the women's suffrage movement. It's the right to vote. Next color. Philosophy. And what we've done with philosophy over the last several centuries is we've gone from Renaissance humanism, we've gone to the scientific Reformation, or the scientific revolution with the scientific method. Then we went to Enlightenment, applying reason instead of faith. Now we've gone to the extreme. Okay, we don't believe anything unless science makes it certain. We don't believe anything until science shows us we can be positive about it. It's called positivism. Again, not something we talked about directly in class, but still a key concept, right? That science alone proves knowledge. It's the ultimate rationalism. Okay? Speaking of which, the science of this era is pretty significant. Now, just like everything else, the science of this era has a couple goals. Primarily, the science of this era is trying to do what? It's trying to help the urban areas, and it's trying to help especially the less privileged. Okay? So, one big change for science is that we found out people were getting sick a lot. Now, we figured out eventually that building a sewer system helped people stop getting sick. That's because we are taking the wastewater out of the city now instead of drinking it. But we also had a guy named Pasteur come up with what? Germ theory. We realized that it's not spirits, it's not bad smells that make us sick, it's tiny little things that cause disease. Living things. And if they're living, it's really important because that means they can be killed. And the guy who figured out how to kill these is a guy named, you know this one, Lister, and he made antiseptics. Those two, I think, are really easy to understand back to back. Because of industrialization in the 1800s, a lot of people moved to urban areas. We ended up creating public health sewer systems, public transportation, redesigning our cities. But ultimately, our scientists discovered what actually make us sick. And once they figured out what makes us sick, we figured out how to kill it. Right? So we stopped getting sick. Another thing I should say, though, is the era going on in the background of the 1800s. With industrialization, we go from just exploring other areas. Industrialization made us want to do what? Colonize or imperialize, right? And the last truly untouched place by Europeans on planet Earth was what? Africa. And so as we tried to explore Africa, but for a couple hundred years, we could really not explore Africa because every time we'd send a group of explorers into Africa and they tried to march to the center of Africa, what would happen? They would get sick from what? Malaria. So we found a inoculation against it. You get injected with this, you are probably not going to get malaria. It's called quinine. Quinine. Or it's a treatment for, I don't remember whether it's inoculation of or treatment for, but doesn't matter. With quinine, we can actually increase our control of Africa. We can imperialize more. Now, the other side of science is Darwin. Again, we are not evolving because of some mystical hand of God. We are evolving because of rational biological change. We understand that, but the real reason Darwin is significant is, again, what's going on in the background of the 1800s? It's imperialism. This leads to social Darwinism. The idea that whites have evolved better than browns or blacks. The idea that whites as a race are simply better. It's not because we have better weapons and can kill other people better. It's because we have actually evolved. Much like, dinosaurs became whatever, or giraffes grew long necks, or different things evolved in different ways. Whites have evolved at a faster rate than the rest of society. That's social Darwinism. And the last thing for science, using rationalism, is we had a guy who took science and he looked at society, and he focused on the less privileged, and he focused on our class distinctions, and that was Marx, of scientific socialism. And he looked at society and said, listen, if we let capitalism rule, then the rich will get richer. The bourgeoisie who control the way to make money will continue to make money at a much faster rate. It's not that I'm making it up. I'm not being emotional. It is fact. Look at history. Look at how society works. That is what happens. That's scientific socialism. I mentioned that that's scientific socialism because in about 100 years, we get a different type of socialism in the 1960s and 1970s. From who? It's called like humanistic socialism. It's hippies. We should all share what we have. We should all own a piece of everything. Not because it's scientific and it would help society. Why do hippies say we should share everything? Because we love one another. And we're all special and amazing and sweet and all that good stuff. Now, my last section right here for this timeline is the art era before this, in the background of the Industrial Revolution. The art, the literature, everything era was what? My favorite. Romanticism. Romanticism, what word do we know with romanticism above all else? Emotion, right? Well, people get sick of romanticism, right? The flowery, the little pirate falls in love with the beautiful damsel in distress and then lives happily ever after, right? Victor Hugo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? All this poor, stupid, ugly thing. Now, his real book is a little more violent at the end, right? But think that Disney. We get sick of that. So we move to our next style, which is realism. Realism in art and literature. It shows everyday people and their everyday social problems. We see alcoholism. We see broken families. The most famous, there's only two authors that you would ever remember. The most famous one is an English guy. And one of his most famous books is a book about the French Revolution. Do you know the English guy? Do you know the book about the French Revolution? The book is called A Tale of Two Cities. The guy is Dickens. Right? Another one of his famous book, Oliver Twists, follows an orphan and the miserable life that he has as an orphan. That's realism, not romanticism, realism. The other guy, the last guy, is a Russian. He wrote about Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And he didn't write romantic stories about soldiers saving the day and running through battle and killing loads of the enemy. He wrote realistic stories about the lives of the peasants. That book is called War and Peace. That man is Leo Tolstoy. So that is realism in literature. Our next timeline is a little more simpler. Now, the timeline we just did, urban life, is really a look at society. Okay? A little bit in politics, but mostly it's about what are people, the regular middle and lower class people, doing, how are they acting, what is affecting them as we start to look at the less privileged. Now, we are going to look at politics. What has European politics been doing since we last left them? Okay? The last timeline we had was conservative versus liberals. We talked about the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and the conservatives took power, but we know the conservatives are going to lose power relatively quickly. So for this second timeline, let's look. We've got 1900 over here. We've got 1800 over here. This is timeline number 12, and it's the nationalism timeline. Now, our clusters for this timeline. First off, we could almost write nationalism again. What's coming before this? We talked about the conservative versus liberal, the downfall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna, the concert system. But the real thing is, as I talked about every little thing that happens politically in the 1800s, what is it all leading to? The unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, some of the anti-Semitism, the Congress of Berlin, Bismarck, Mazzini. What's it all leading to? World War I, right? In the best way that smart people say that we ended up in World War I was that the unification of Italy and Otto von Bismarck, what did they do to Europe that made Europe sick? The balance of power is going to be upset in this timeline, worse than it ever has before. So, there's a couple things we're going to use a lot of colors here. Let's do nationalism. Okay. Now, there's a couple things with nationalism that we can do. First off, it is very romantic. Right? Realism will come at the end. But romantic right here, the single solitary hero saving the world, uniting his country. So it's romantic. It's definitely a political union. It makes sense for Germany to become one country. It makes sense for Italy to become one country. Finally, there's a term you haven't seen before, but I think you'll recognize it fits here. We call it racialism. The idea that it's not just Germany politically should become a country, but the German race should be unified. The German race should be unified for them. Tyus, give me my water bottle on the table. Good boy. All right. So other nationalistic points. That's on you. The other nationalistic points is the very first true romantic nationalistic individual was in Italy. It was a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini. And he's a guy who stood up one day, ripped off his shirt and said, all of Italy should become one great country. He was an idealist, he was a romantist, and he was ruling he was coming to power not long after the Congress of Berlin. So what happens to him? The conservatives in power say, don't like what you're saying, and string him up a tree and kill him. Okay? I do want to actually mention one weird one. I didn't think this would ever be a key concept, but one thing that helped bring Germany together, this racialism, is the idea that not only are we starting to maybe the idea that the Aryan race, the Nordic German, is really what they are and who they can focus on, but another thing that brings people together, you'll know this from Human Geo, is language. Okay? Language, actually, we saw it with the Protestant Reformation, right? The Bible was first translated into German, and that helped bring people together under this new protest ideas. But another big step for language was that somebody wrote something that everybody read. And there's a couple ways to get everybody to read something. You can write something like the Enlightenment that's so important, so significant, that it analyzes society and analyzes themselves, that people want to read it because it's significant. What's another way to get people to read something? What? Make it interesting. So we had a couple guys rewrite the most interesting stories in the world. What was their name? They're called the Brothers Grimm, or the Grimm Brothers. What did they rewrite? The fairy tales, right? Grimm's fairy tales. They rewrote them in German. They became very popular, and it gave Germans some kind of shared history that they're going to hold on to. Now, this was not all good racialism, as we'd call maybe Grimm's fairy tales. There's also, exactly as you would imagine, very racist racialism. Because it's not just the idea that all of Germany is one race, so they should be united. It's that all of Germany is one race, and other people aren't our race. In the late 1900s, we started to see a growing movement of anti-Semitism. Okay? And we're not actually starting in Germany. We're going to start in France. Do you remember the Dreyfus Affair? The Dreyfus Affair was the moment where a French officer who was a Jew, was accused of doing something illegal or bad, basically treason, by a bunch of non-Jews who didn't like him. And what came out in this affair was that he in fact did nothing wrong, and people just decided that, people realized that these non-Jews just really hated this guy for being Jewish. It burned a lot of the French army, it burned a lot of the French military, but it made the anti-Semitism in France really well known. There was another guy named Karl Lueger. And if you can't tell by his name, he's not French. He's actually the mayor of Vienna. Okay? And he has a lot of anti-Semite pamphlets. He talks about needing to get rid of the Jews, how good Austria would be without Jews there. And why is he significant if he's preaching anti-Semitism in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Vienna, Austria? Because Adolf Hitler travels to Vienna, Austria around this time, listens to Karl Lueger, and buys into a lot of his ideas. Now, the one anti-Semitism thing, an idea for Jews as racialism, bringing Jews together. In the late 1800s, we see a guy, this hasn't been on the test for a while, named Herzl. And Herzl says the Jews are a race. The Jews deserve to be together. The Jews deserve their own country. Now, eventually, this will become the country of Israel. But do you know the term used for Jews needing or getting or deserving their own home country? You ever heard that term? It's called Zionism. And know it. Okay? Now, I got about 5 minutes. We're going to go fast, but I think I can get done. If you need to leave, as always, go ahead. The next thing, let's switch colors. Let's look at the concert of Europe failing. So number 2, the concert of Europe. Now, what was the concert of Europe? It is essentially the 1815 Congress of Vienna when the conservatives rose to power. What they did was they created a Congress system, or a concert of Europe. And what they said was, all right, if there's ever liberals that try to rise up in your country, we'll call up each other, we'll all get together, and we'll burn them to the ground. Well, Mazzini is a liberal. He rises up in Italy, the concert of Europe shows up, and Mazzini gets killed. There's some early ones in France that happens, there's some ones in Austria, there's some ones in Russia, but this starts to fail. And when that fails, the balance of power starts to change. As the balance of power changes, we will look at different ways it fails. Around this time in France, they have something called the July Revolution. This is what Les Mis is based after. Okay? The July Revolution is this liberal revolution that's trying to change France's government. It does not end the government of having a king, right, being in charge. But it does end that king. Do you know the last name of the king who's in charge of France before the July Revolution? It's Bourbon. So, it's the end of the Bourbons. This is about 1830. And the Bourbons are historically, besides the Habsburgs, the most powerful ruling family. So that's a pretty big blow to them. Another reason that the balance of power is ending is there is a war in the 1850s called the Crimean War. It was a significant war. We talked about it because Britain and France are fighting what country? Where's Crimea? Russia. Okay? They're fighting Russia. And what lesson does Russia learn from this war? They learn that they are incredibly far behind the rest of Europe in industrialization. They realize they don't have railroads, they don't have repeating rifles and all this other junk. But why is this war fought? Well, the Crimean Peninsula is right here in the Black Sea, and they are basically fighting over who gets to control Constantinople. Right? So the fact that France and Great Britain are fighting against Russia over this is a really good sign that the Ottoman Empire is ending. And they're ending really, really, really fast. So the Crimean War shows us that the Ottomans are weakening. Now, to be truthful, we don't care much about the Ottomans. But what we do care about is this region in Europe that they control. What's the name of this peninsula? The Balkans, right? And the Balkans, when they lose the single controlling factor, the single country that's ruling this whole region, and not only do they lose that single ruler, they're losing it in this era. What's the name of this era? Nationalism. What's going to happen to the Balkans when the single unifying force packs up and leaves? It's going to literally balkanize. It's going to break up as smaller regions decide they want their own country. Okay? Now, what all of this leads to is a new conservatism. And this, what's going to fill in right here and right here, this is what last year's entire DBQ was about. So no pressure. This new conservatism is a little bit more like modern conservatism. We are going to use nationalism to strengthen the state, right? We are going to make sure people love our country. Not love our king, though that's nice. We want to make them loyal to our country above all else. And the three examples of this, two countries, three examples. First up, in 1848, when France throws out the old government, they do still want a leader, a single strong leader, and they get Napoleon III. Okay? Napoleon III takes over. And the reason I mention him here politically is, do you remember what he did in the last timeline? He's the guy who goes to the great works of industry of all nations, right? And realizes that France is really far behind, so he's the guy who does urban redesign. He puts in the sewer, he puts in the water, he institutes public transportation, so he starts to modernize France. Okay? The other guy is all the way in the south, the Italian one. His name, he comes after Mazzini, his name is Cavour. And instead of being the romantic guy who, oh my God, why don't we all just form a country because we're Italian and we should be great? He says, no. This is the one word you should know for Cavour. He uses, realpolitik. Realpolitik is not ideological. It's not what should happen. It's what can happen. Look at the situation. How should things act? The other guy right here is obviously Bismarck. Put a star underneath him. He gets his own title. Okay? Bismarck. Rewrite the term realpolitik. When you get to Otto von Bismarck, you will use the term realpolitik. That is a guarantee. Ultimately, what he does is he changes the balance of power of Europe. He will unite Germany, and the thing is, after he unites Germany, he makes Germany truly a powerful and strong country. And he makes Germany a powerful and strong country in two ways. Why is Germany powerful and strong? You guys know. Zollverein was a good starting point. They become the industrial capital, so industry becomes really, 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 really strong. Okay? And he uses that industry to do what? How does Germany become a country in the first place? War. Right? Diplomacy, industry and war makes them a country. And by the way, under Bismarck up here, we should have a date. What's that date? 1871. The changing balance and power of Europe, the thing that does more than anything else to lead to World War I. Now, one big thing he does is diplomacy. And we're almost done. Sorry about that. I need about 2 more minutes. You can leave if you're late. As soon as he goes to country, who's his biggest enemy? His biggest enemy is France, right? The last country he beats up, just the undying enemy and hate that Germany and France will have for one another. He actually creates something called the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance. The sole reason for creating the Triple Alliance was to isolate France. Right? It's significant because we are once again leading to World War I. Right? What's France, by the way, next timeline, what's France going to do against this? They create the Triple Entente. When the first Moroccan crisis brings France and England closer together, they decide to go ahead and join the Triple Entente together, and we are setting the stakes for World War II. The last thing that happens to Otto von Bismarck is in that 1890 he gets dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II. And after he gets dismissed, Kaiser Wilhelm II takes over. Is Kaiser Wilhelm II as good as Otto von Bismarck? No. So Germany starts to create more chaos. Germany starts to get a whole lot crazier, and we are leading even more quickly to to World War II. The second to last point right here is in this region after the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1878. We have something called the Congress of Berlin. In the Congress of Berlin, Europe decided how it's going to split up the Balkan Empire. Why do we care about Europe splitting up the Balkan Empire? Because that's the powder keg that's going to lead to World War II. And our last thing is very simply a restate of something that happened earlier. What happens to the Balkans? With the Ottomans weakening in power, the Balkans go through Balkanization. And how does that lead to World War I? Primarily, they're going to become the powder keg. Tensions between these new, smaller countries rise and rise and rise and rise and rise. And actually, in the first century of the 1900s, right in here, there is the first, and then there's the second Balkan War. And why is the First and Second Balkan War significant? Because it's adding to tensions that will eventually boil over and cause World War I.